Society Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Gilad Avrahami. I'm the Programs and Development Coordinator here at hmTv. This podcast is a production of the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. On today's episode of The Past Has an Afterlife here on hmTv, my special guest, Professor Barak Mendelsohn, will join me for a conversation about his journey as a faculty member at Haverford College and what justice looks like in practice at a liberal arts college today. Professor Mendelsohn, Barak, thank you so much for joining me. I was also at Haverford College. I know you are a professor there, and I was a student there from 2018 until 2022. I never took one of your classes, but we got to know each other a little bit at school. And I invited you today because you have a really interesting and hopefully very informative story about what being a faculty member can look like at a college like Haverford. So I was wondering if you can tell me about what Haverford was like when you arrived. When did you get there, and what did it look like at that time?
First, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Even though the things that we're going to discuss are less pleasant. I arrived at Haverford during the summer of 2007. I was born and raised in Israel. I came to the United States in the summer of 2000 to start my PhD studies at Cornell. And after I graduated, I returned to Israel for a year before taking a job here at Haverford. And I've been here since then. I'm a scholar of terrorism. In fact, in our region of Philadelphia and its suburbs, I'm the only scholar that does the combination of international relations, security studies, terrorism, and Middle East. The focus of my work is on the jihadi movement, especially Al-Qaeda, but I wrote extensively about different aspects of relationship between states and armed non-state actors, including state sponsorship. So when I came to the United States, nobody really cared about the Middle East. Then 9/11 happened. And suddenly in 2007, I actually had job prospects in the United States. So I came to Haverford, not knowing much about Haverford or even the Quaker ethos, because I came from Israel. We are not taught much about what it means to be a Quaker institution. Interestingly, when I got here, it became pretty evident that Haverford College doesn't know what it means to be an institution with either Quaker roots or a Quaker institution. And often we see that members of the Haverford community are inventing Quaker traditions, are selectively choosing certain aspects of what it means to be a Quaker over others, and many times are just, searching in the dark for some things that they could legitimize by saying that they relate to our Quaker heritage. So I arrived at 2007, been at Haverford since then, finishing my 19th year at Haverford. Amazing how the time flew. The college changed significantly since 2007. It's not that I was not critical even then, just by nature of my personality. But in 2007, we were working in a very different environment. There was much more freedom. People could speak their mind. People did not fear speaking their mind. It was allowed to make mistakes. It's not easy to articulate yourself always in the perfect way, but if people assume that others don't have negative intentions, we can always discuss that. There was much greater interest in actually discussing politics. I was unhappy that students did not know much about what's actually going on in the world, but I could not imagine that over about close to 20 years later, students will be even more clueless about the world around them at the time that we just have information at the tip of our hands.
Sure. And do you see Haverford and just in general college education? That's part of what I felt I was going into when I started college, is that that's an opportunity to learn lots of new things, go into topics I knew nothing about, and be willing to, to have these long discussions, to entertain different ideas, to recognize that the world is a lot more complicated than it's made out to be when we're younger, right? And so I wonder, when you saw that potential at Haverford, when you were starting out, where did you see it? How did you, as a professor, try to kind of act on it? And then, how did you see that fall apart a little bit?
Well, when I arrived there, I'm studying security in an institution with Quaker roots, right? So I always knew that I don't fit especially well with the narrative, but while there were faculty that were unhappy about hiring somebody that studies security, students actually were interested in learning more about a more complex world. That's a very, very different kind of environment than the environment that we have now. I mean, even then, students were worried about saying anything that might not fit too well within the general ideas that seem acceptable at Haverford. But what ideas are considered acceptable at Haverford has completely shrunk over the last 20 years. So if I was disappointed by some of the discussions back then, looking back, I was so lucky to have those discussions, because if you go since 2014, 15, this is a completely different kind of environment. When I think about, liberal arts college is supposed to be all about exposing you. Different subjects, different disciplines, different ways of thinking about issues, being able to think not just instrumentally, but actually developing your critical skills. And do that in a friendly environment. We are a tiny school. We have only 1,400 students. At times that students are friendly, and at times that this functions as a community, this is fantastic, because people can rely on others. As we found out since October 7, and in fact a few years earlier already, that same small size that can be a great benefit at sometimes and with different student body has now become destructive and very, very problematic.
I think some of that movement that's happened since the time that you arrived has been viewed as progress, right? There's a feeling that there weren't enough values embedded into how college was taught, that there were too many different ideas let loose, and that was a very, very dangerous thing. And people really grasp very tightly onto the idea that there's a very specific set of things. Now, I think what we can discuss here, and what I'd love to get to later, is whether the things that they grasped onto actually fit some of those goals that they have of achieving justice and of eradicating hate, those sorts of things. But they felt as though that would be the way to accomplish that. So having more and more and more values built into everything, and having anything that didn't seem to fit those values kind of be pushed away. And what I think is interesting in understanding what they chose and why they chose it has a lot to do with some key events that took place in the years since you arrived here. So what do you think happened, and why did that drive people to really focus on certain things and not others, or to, want to protect certain groups very, very, very firmly, and at times, violently or very intensely or militantly, and other groups to not pay attention to. What do you see as the inciting incidents for that?
Well, first, I just want to clarify that it's not necessarily the whole student body. All you need is that kind of shift to happen with a dominant group of students that take positions of student governance, and that together with ideological faculty and administration can cause these kind of devastating effects. In 2008, we had an economic crisis. I've been counting looking at the analogies to the previous century. I've been expecting the things will go bad after that. And it's not surprising that we saw the rise of populism, both from the left and from the right, coming after the economic crisis. And this is one of the things that we're seeing, because the movement that you see on colleges are basically a populist movement, rather than a very substantive kind of group. We had the rise of social media. And with the rise of social media, the ability to bully online. And we have seen that as people became such strong believers that they have the right on their side, and only on their side, they use these tools in order to further intimidate people that thought differently. And then, of course, we had the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, the movement is important. The goals that it was trying to promote is absolutely necessary. But the result was that many people started looking at everything only through the lens of race. Suddenly, race became the only salient factor. And anybody that dared to have a more critical approach to that. For example, we were told that now we are anti-racist institution. What does it mean to be an anti-racist institution? All that kind of stuff was always very vague, articulated by people that maybe have some arts with some abilities with words, but without any kind of real substance. And so, but feeling that justice is on their side, these people steamrolled everybody that held a different position. Now, for faculty, this is hard because we find ourselves thinking way more about every sentence that we make. This is a really hard environment to teach, definitely to discuss controversial issues. But this is even worse for students, because a student that needs to think so hard about what he is saying or what she is saying, and whether this is how that's going to affect them. Right? You got the pronoun wrong, right? You're going to be canceled. Any kind of mistake might result in canceling you. And so students, rightly so, say, why should we take that kind of risk when we know that there are people that are just waiting? It seems like this is the only thing that they really care for, is to try to catch other people violating their important moral code. And these people, in a very authoritarian way. It's pretty funny that they are priding themselves for their democracy when they are acting very similar to the authoritarian figures from the right. Right? It's the same kind of preventing people that have other positions from arguing them. And they do that without actually really arguing. If you look at the most problematic faculty that we have at Haverford when it comes to issues of anti-Semitism, there is a reason most of them come from disciplines that don't really understand the idea of causality, of cause and effect, that can just spew general claims that will lead to anti-Semitism without actually articulating any kind of mechanism, serious mechanisms. There is a reason why none of the political science professors even some that are highly critical of Israel, never joined any of those basically anti-Semitic outfits because the intellectual work that they're doing, well, it's anti-intellectualism. It's not an intellectual work at all. But these are the people that now have much greater role on academic campuses because the Black Lives Matters and the rise of the DEI meant that now college administrators had the ability to actually plant and hire people basically based on their identity rather than on their real qualifications. So what we're seeing is that the rise of identity politics that happens throughout the country is especially pronounced in academic institutions and especially in a small liberal place like Haverford.
I want to make it a little bit more concrete for people. Let's talk about what things have happened at Haverford to specific people or the sorts of interactions that you've noticed, incidents that have been, in your view, the clearest and most obvious articulation of some of the things you're talking about, and also some of the greatest betrayals of the initial values that you felt were important in the first place at a college like this. So what were some of those the most disturbing or unpleasant things that you know about? And also very important to this conversation, what did the administration do? Because it's one thing to see students act. That's something that happens everywhere, is that individual people do terrible things. But what you've sort of started to mention is taking place at Haverford and helps to kind of set it a little bit apart and to set it in a category where there's less protection for people than in other places. What do you see as the reaction or the role of the administration when incidents like this take place?
Sadly, I actually have a long list of possible cases. What they all share is incompetence by the administration. Well, I thought at first it was incompetence. Later on, I became convinced it's actually a malicious intent to just allow this kind of anti-Semitism and hostility and hate to fester at Haverford. Among the events, a teaching about how Israel basically weaponized COVID against the Palestinians, playing on old anti-Semitic tropes about Jews as spreading diseases. Celebrations of October 7, on October 7 and the day after, by some students, by some faculty, with the administration providing excuses, which is just unbelievable to me. Well, 2.5 years after October 7, I believe anything now about the Haverford College. Among the other things, just in February, beginning of February, we had a speaker here, Chaviv Gur-Rettig. The talk was disrupted by a bunch of almost fully masked disruptors from Haverford and Bryn Mawr, but also probably some others. We had difficulties to tell because of the way that they were covered. And they were dressed in a way that was designed to intimidate an audience of mostly Jewish crowd from the Lower Merion area in which we are located. During that talk, one of the disruptions involved somebody that managed to sneak a bullhorn into the event. And I can tell you that, our first instinct seeing something coming out was that this is a weapon. In fact, me and many of the members of the audience that saw this group of people coming in, and we have seen enough movies of and experienced terrorism enough to see the similarities. And when we saw these people, there were members of the audience that immediately left, fearing for their lives. Yeah? This is not an environment that fosters free speech. The college in general does extremely little. Now, let me give you another example. At close to the end of 2025, two of the students, members of the student governing body, were overheard loudly discussing how they discriminate against a Chabad student group. They were given a large sum of money, students on a student council, to disseminate among the different student groups. And here you have students that are bragging about how they invented bureaucratic maneuvers so that they can deny a Jewish group funds. These are not their own funds. These are not their parents' funds. These are the funds that came from tuitions of all parents. Yet these students, with cooperation with others, managed to discriminate against Jewish students. We complained. The college has yet to come up. It's been 4 months. You would expect first that the students that are responsible will not be in a position to ever disseminate money again, at least not before a quick investigation is concluded. Second, we would expect a quick investigation. It's been 4 months. Moreover, in those 4 months, the students involved were actually embraced by the college. The college refused to suspend them from their role. I'm not even saying suspend them from Haverford, which I think they should be suspended, actually kicked out of the Haverford. I'm not sure that this is not even criminal. But the college has been mute, said nothing about it, trying to hide, and instead actually embrace those offenders. Yeah? Of course, this is the message that students at Harvard will get. If you go against the Jews, you're going to be fine. Right? As long as you're anti-Zionist or anti-Jews, you will be fine. Right? The only person that actually underwent real investigation was me, because I dared to respond to students when I came out publicly and said that Haverford has a serious problem of anti-Semitism. Haverford is trying to silence the voices, the very few voices, because everybody at Haverford is timid. It's a small place. In a small place like that, people make considerations whether they should speak or not. And their instinct, when they look around them, is to shut up, because speaking up is costly. Right? It's not just about trying to cancel you. It can be also about trying to fire you. Right? Moreover than that, I got myself death threats against me and my family. The fact that I can live on campus, and our sense is that if something happens to me, there will be a big party on campus, not that anybody will actually care, I think really reflects, at the least, how many of the Jewish members of the Harvard community feel about how the college is treating us.
Right. Well, I think that reflects so well the real danger that lies in the approach that's being taken right now. The fact that there are no clear boundaries whatsoever in the instances in which the action being taken is by someone who is, as you're saying, either anti-Zionist or in some other way fits into that those category of things that are very good for progress, whether or not they are. In many instances, they aren't. But the non-existence of boundaries and the ability for the administration to sort of selectively decide when justice is sort of immediate behind closed doors to people they don't like, and restorative is a term that is used often. That I had an incident in which I was on campus, and when I was there were a lot of these things that you're discussing that predate October 7th and that didn't have anything to do specifically with Zionism, although of course that always came up because it has never been a topic that was not relevant to college students. But going back a little bit, I was in there was a student strike that took place in 2020 in the context of that strike. And I think the details are very interesting, but not very relevant, because what I want to really emphasize is the lengths that people will be willing to go to, as you're saying, silence or intimidate people who are in opposition to that general party line that is taken by, the students at the front lines of some of these movements. And the things that were done interpersonally between students are some of the most shocking and upsetting ones, because they aren't a question of someone just being caught in something or being caught in, there was a person who went in with a bullhorn and, caused a lot of people to fear for their lives. That person didn't know those other people. In some of these other instances, they did, right? They kicked people off teams because they didn't sign on to a strike document. And if you want to look up the strike document, you should, just to get a sense of how specific and in some cases bizarre the terms of the strike document were, and how divorced as well they were from the original Black Lives Matter movement they were about. There were international students who were told they were selfish because they wanted to go to class, so by their friends, right? And who lost friends because they were told that they shouldn't want to go to class because it would interfere with the strike. These international students who are only there or only able to be there because of these international visas for them to study in the United States.
But by the way, that's the only way that the international students were discussed. Nobody actually cared for their position. Right? When people speak about inclusiveness, encouraging inclusiveness at Haverford, they never speak about the Chinese students that we have at Haverford. I never see the student body actually trying to do anything to incorporate foreign students, to make them feel more welcome. It's a very particular kind of people that are accepted. And by the way, you probably remember, I had a huge clash with students over that strike, not because I did not support the strike, but because I dared to give a platform to people that oppose the strike to express their positions. That's all I did. That was enough for students to start a campaign that continued and then accelerated after October 7.
Yes, well, it accelerated in a lot of ways, and the manifestations of them were often the same. So the sort of lengths that people would go to intimidate people. For example, they threatened to kill the president's dog, the Haverford College president's dog, during the strike, and they actually did vandalize the Bryn Mawr president's house. And in the time since then, between protests, between the example that you gave about the people barging in with the bullhorn, they're demonstrating a sort of distance from the sort of basic fundamental elements of respect that sustain, I think, the initial version of what college was like when you started teaching there. So I think that what this goes into that I find interesting. Sorry, are you there? Just because we don't see you anymore, but I hear you, I think. Yes. Okay, good. Okay, we're good. Is if we can talk about the new justice, just to wrap up, because it is so often framed in terms of justice. And what I've noticed is that it's often seen as anything that attempts to restore or to amend historical wrongs, so to undertake historical reckoning, is fair game, and that's demonstrated in the actions that people do to one another and the actions that are taken generally by the student body, by the student council, and by the Haverford government. And the parallels to history. So, for example, the Chinese Cultural Revolution was initially, and throughout the time that it took place, it was framed as this attempt to eradicate these elements of the system that they didn't like. And that term also is brought up often today, the idea that everything in the system is rotten. So whatever you need to do to take down the system. Religion is part of that system. Traditional family structures are part of that system. Culture is part of that system. So it's in this way very authoritarian and goes so deeply against those things that I think it's built against the concepts of trust, concern, and respect that are evoked time and again at Haverford, et cetera. So what do you think is the direction we're going in? Do you think there is an end? Is there an end point? Is there a teleological, I suppose, if we're using academic terms, because we're talking about college, teleological kind of conclusion to where we're going with this, what the goals of these movements are, and how they know when to stop and if they know when to stop? Because in my view, through all these things that I've seen and the sort of lengths that are gone to intimidate people, I don't see a clear end, and I don't see a clear goal other than tearing things down. So what do you see in this progress?
Last year I taught a one-time seminar, semester long, about terrorism in the United States during the 1960s and 70s. It was almost impossible to do that class without actually thinking about the current environment in which we operate. And many of the conclusions are pretty similar. You have a failed social movement that produces radical elements that, as they are frustrated, they try to escalate. Also engage in purity tests that ultimately continuously shrink their group, uh, leave them just as pissed off people, but without actually making any kind of real difference through that kind of activity. So when I look at the claims for justice that we see now, I find them pretty ridiculous. I'm not trying to, on many things, I'm not sure that I can give such a clear and easy choice about what is actually just. And in fact, sometimes you might even need to compromise on some justice for the sake of pragmatism. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I think that pragmatism is also an important value. Because if you will continuously look for justice, you might actually create additional injustices. So when all those people that are screaming from the river to the sea, uh, their notion of justice is the genocide to the Israeli people. That doesn't seem to me very just. And so they have very little understanding of the complex nature of justice. They have a very easy division. They have a ridiculous racial theory that relies on hierarchies uh, of the oppressed and the oppressors. That's the only thing. When I mention that we have people, that most of the people that are actually the problem are people that are not deep thinkers, that's what I mean, because this is a systemic theory. It gives you a very abstract notion of what is actually going on, and it must be handled with care. It can never function on its own. But because of that kind of thinking, it's an easy division. You're either with us or you are the oppressor. Right? So it's easy for them to make crude distinctions. They're in fact doing all the crimes they are continuously arguing against, discriminating against people, essentializing people. On October 6th, I was just a scholar and an educator, somebody that studies the subject that the following day would be so important. But on October 7th, in my own institution, I found out that I'm no longer the scholar that I thought. Maybe I wasn't ever seen as the scholar and educator that I thought that I am. I was just seen as the Jew from Israel, not even as the American that I am, simply as the Jew from Israel. So you have this ideology, that theory that divides to oppressed and oppressor, that is based on racial distinctions, which of course makes then all Jews white, even though many Jews are not, and even though many white people on the extreme right will want to kill us for being Jews. I do not have anything in common with them. And so you have these combined together, and then you have administrators that are buying into this nonsense. You have people in DEI bodies that are promoting that ideology. Now, again, I'm all for inclusion and diversity, but inclusion and diversity does not go just one way. In fact, I think that Haverford would really benefit if we will have a buttload of students from Texas, yeah, from other places that actually can shed different light on the world, that actually tell people you don't even need to argue about anything. Just hearing their stories about the way that they live tells you that maybe we live in a different America, that maybe we cannot, project from our own experience to suggest that this must be the experience of everybody, and that people that don't think like us, then they must be an enemy. I mean, it got to the ridiculous point that I had a student, I think that he graduated a year before, 2 years after you did, or a year after you did, who wanted to write a blog post about why do people in rural Pennsylvania vote for Trump. He did not say vote for Trump. He did not say don't vote for Trump. Just trying to do an analytical piece, but was terrified. This is how anti-intellectual Haverford has become. That students are worried that even something like that would lead to canceling them. So, in that kind of atmosphere, with that kind of shallow thinking, we see that the college is moving away from pursuing intellectual approach towards pursuit of justice through activism. But this is justice that is not really thought through. And this is activism that is pretty stupid activism. Again, I'm for activism, but activism has to be based on learning. You first need to actually know before you can do effective activism. What we saw here was not effective activism, it was just virtue signaling, and the victims of the virtue signaling was everybody that was thinking differently than the dominant activist that basically took over the discourse here, together with some faculty and with administrators. So to hear about restorative justice practices here, I find it just ludicrous. There is no justice here, there is no restorative. Uh, when it came to anti-Semitism, we actually found that there is no harmful community even. Because when it comes to Jews, we are alone. We had hardly anybody that was not Jewish from the institution sympathizing with us, trying to understand our claims. Most of what we got was just rejection because we did not fit their notions of what Haverford is. And so we had to be dismissed. So I'm not very optimistic about that aspect. On the other hand, when the Trump administration came to power, we saw huge change in the atmosphere here. Not because there was any understanding that what happened before was wrong, just because we now had external pressure on the college. And to remind people, the college president had a horrendous performance in Congress, in congressional hearing about a year ago. Really, the most embarrassing performance that I've seen. And so the college is now responsive to some extent to pressures, uh, but it that did not see any kind of, I did not observe any kind of real change and understanding how wrong they were before in their approach. And so I do not expect that Harvard is going to start to pursue a more reasonable, complicated version of justice. Um, I do hope that maybe a new president will start working to undo the huge amount of damage that this current Haverford administration did. But I'm not sure how successful it will be. It's really hard to be optimistic, but I guess we have to.
We have to, and we'll have to see. And a lot of it, the things that have taken place up till this moment have a lot to do with what the students wanted. I think in the end, the administration followed because they realized students were feeling a certain way. And just by that same token, all it would take, or at least the most of the work that it would take for something to change, is for students to take up the mantle of what we're discussing right now and recognizing that in order to achieve those values and those goals of justice and of like real learning and of appreciation of democracy and all of those elements that have sort of been lost in the shuffle here, that they need to have a real passion for working towards that and to reintegrating that back into the college. And here at the Holocaust Center,
last example of the fact that this is not really about politics. This is not really about pursuit of justice. I'm one of the most left-wing professors at Haverford. My approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is pretty controversial because I'm pretty much in the left. On the face of it, after October 7, I should have been a bridge. If you are actually pro-Palestinian, you should want to speak with people that would like to pursue peace, that will allow both Palestinians and Israelis to live together, because none of these people is going away. What we saw instead was that you had to basically mark all the Jews for whom Israel is part of their identity as the enemy. There was no discussion of how do we make peace. All you had are just basic statements that the implications of those statements made in the name of justice was genocide for Israelis.
I agree. I don't think it's about politics at all. I think that any discussions about Israel, as demonstrated by some of the actions people have taken, just at the mention of Israel or the mention of a discussion, between Israelis and others, anything in that sphere, that there was a cohort of people who was very deeply opposed to that. And that's, I think, where the battleground of sorts is here in the United States, of recognizing that there is this contingent of people who does have that really deep opposition to every country living peacefully and having self-determination, and sort of there's very basic elements that we thought we had sorted out a long time ago. And at the Holocaust Center, what we teach people is that the Holocaust was largely enabled by inaction, by the fact that people, when they recognized that something around them didn't really make sense, that they weren't ready or willing to speak up. And the fact that inaction is just nearly, at least, as always, action is the thing that's most responsible, but inaction, or the lack thereof, plays a very important role in determining whether something will eventually be lessened, whether a movement like this will succeed, or whether it will be deterred. So I just want to encourage everyone who's listening to think about how they can start these conversations, use some of the discussions that we had today to promote a new and much better version of what real trust, concern, and respect can be. Barak, it has been a true pleasure to speak with you today. I'm mostly just so sorry to hear about and to learn about all the things that have happened to you and the way that you've been treated in this whole time. It doesn't surprise me, sort of, in the way that you've said to me as well. It doesn't, in the end, seem that surprising given everything else that's happened. But it is certainly a wake-up call for all of us to step up and do something. So I want to thank everyone for tuning into this episode of The Past Has an Afterlife on hmTv. I would like to very deeply thank my guest, Professor Barak Mendelsohn, for sharing his experiences and his wisdom about this critical moment on university campuses and in the ways that we develop, support, and challenge our youth. If you enjoyed exploring the information, history, and stories in today's conversations, be sure to check out our other podcasts here on hmTv. Please subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations. Until next time, take care and be well.